Thank you all for coming out today. For those of you that have never met me, my name is Precious Gunter. I am the Director of the Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. And we want to first just thank you all for coming out today for this Comply and Complain workshop. We feel like this is a very important issue that we can discuss, that we've had students and employees here express concerns about. And so we think this is just a good way to communicate and build relationships with the community and have a better understanding of implicit bias and microaggressions and how they affect us all in our everyday lives. So we have 3 speakers here with us today. The first one is Sgt Dorsey. We also have the Honorable Mr. Neal. He is the former mayor of Tuskegee, Alabama. And then we also have Dr. Terrence Allen, who's a research specialist in social sciences, particularly in juvenile justice issues. So I will start with bringing up Mr. Neal. Thank you.
In addition to various patrol divisions assignments, Sgt Dorsey was assigned to traffic divisions, Newton Area Vice OIC, and the infamous gang unit in operations of South Bureau, known as the Community Resource Against Street Hoodlums, CRASH. Cheryl is a person who is not only nationally known, but she's internationally known. You can see her, you may have seen her on CNN, Fox News, OWN Network, CNN International, HLN TV with Nancy Grace, The Daily Show, Inside Edition, MSNBC, as well as This News, which is a KPCC, Democracy Now! She's been on the Tom Joyner Morning Show, as well as KABC Radio, Talk Radio. She's been with Dr. Drew. She has been on Tavis Smiley's show, Dr. Phil's show, TD Jakes, and she's even been on my show. That's the zenith of her career right there. Just last week, Cheryl, I've been on radio now for 28 years, and Cheryl was on my show last week, and it was an honor to have her on my show. I want you to do that same welcome that the guy in the security booth did. Because I want her to feel like she's appreciated. She came all the way from Los Angeles, California, down to Fort Myers, Florida, to just share with you her story. Ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing? Wow. Thank you for having me. I am so excited to be here this morning and share with you. And so, you know, we've heard a lot from Mayor Omar this morning about bias and how it plays in interactions. And so while I'm going to talk to you this morning about my experiences based on my law enforcement career, understand that what I'm talking about really is not unique to law enforcement. And the trials and the tribulations that I had as a young police officer on a predominantly male white LAPD in 1980 is not unique to law enforcement. It's happening in libraries and hospitals and post offices, right? You've heard the term going postal, right? So, you know, although my experiences are based on police work, as I talk to you and share with you, interchange as you see fit, FGCU, because those kinds of things could happen here. And so what I know is that you can't change what you tolerate, and that silence is agreement. And I've said that no one is immune. And so I speak to you as a woman, and as a mother of 4 sons, and as a police sergeant last. I started this journey in 2013 on the heels of an event that occurred in Los Angeles, and some of you may know about it. There was a black police officer by the name of Christopher Dorner who had been fired by the department, and he went on a killing spree. He ultimately killed 4 people, and then he was killed. And while I don't know Christopher Dorner, and I certainly don't condone what Christopher Dorner did, I understood how someone could be pushed to do something so outrageous and egregious if you're not constituted right. And so I wanted to first speak out about my own truth so that other police officers who find themselves similarly situated like Christopher Dorner did understand that you don't get to kill folks because you think you've been done a disservice or you have a grievance with your employer. And I wanted officers to know that I too had experienced some of those same things that Christopher Dorner complained about, but I weathered the storm and I made it to the finish line. And so I wanted to be a source of encouragement. I wanted folks to know that you have options. And I also wanted his mother, if she ever heard of me or read my book, to know what would cause her son to do this thing that was probably very foreign to her, that could not be the person she raised. You know, as a mom, we do the best that we can with our children. We raise them and we let them go, and we hope that they do the right thing. And so I couldn't imagine as a mother what it must be like for her to hear someone talk about her child in a way that was very foreign to her and not understand how he got there. And so for anyone who's not on the police department, if you don't have an insight into the inner workings, it could be very frustrating, I would imagine, to wonder what happened, what goes on day to day that would cause someone to go postal. So that was what started this journey for me. And then shortly after that, I wrote the book and published it and all of that, and started appearing on CNN because they found out that there was a voice out there that was different than what they had heard. And then in New York, Eric Garner happened. And a couple of weeks after that, in Ferguson, Missouri, Mike Brown, 2 black men, not necessarily young, but 2 black men who lost their lives at the hand of a police officer. And so again, I'm watching television and I'm seeing families who are hurting, and I see reporters shoving a microphone in their face and asking, well, what do you want to say to the police? If you could talk to the police, what would you say? What do you want done? And they really didn't have the words because they're just grieving, they're just hurting. And so they didn't know what to say. They knew that they didn't want anyone else to feel this way. And they had questions. They wanted to know, why did the police officer do this thing that the officer did that ended in the death of their loved one? And so as I'm watching, I'm understanding that I could facilitate, maybe stand in the gap for these families and ask the kinds of questions that they didn't know to ask to get the kinds of answers that they were looking for, because I understand what it is to be a parent, and I understand what it is to be a police officer, and I understand that it's a difficult job. And I understand that police officers do things sometimes that people don't necessarily know why we do. And so I hope, as I share with you today, because there are no young people in the room, but I hope you'll go back and share with your young people some of the things that I'm going to say with you today, because while police officers certainly have an affirmative responsibility to do the right thing, the public also has a responsibility, and thus the name of my tour, Comply and Complain. I tell young people all the time, trying to hold court curbside will get you hurt. As a police officer, if I stop you, I may have information that you are not aware of, and while you may think that I'm just messing with you, while you may think you're being racially profiled, I may have been given information that you're not aware of, and Now is not the time for me to explain that, because I'm trying to do my job and I need to be safe, and I want you to be safe as we do it. So I wanted to help these families and start speaking out and giving them the words to ask. And I also wanted the community to understand the part that they play in terms of police-community relations, and that while it's not a perfect system, again, everyone has a part to play, and I encourage folks to be engaged in your community. I encourage people to vote, because every police chief serves at the pleasure of a mayor. I encourage people to attend community meetings when you have an opportunity to, and engage your police officers. And I encourage people to join the police department. I think it's an amazing job. It afforded me an opportunity to do this. My experiences, had I not had them, I would not be able to speak in the way that I do about what police officers do day in and day out. And so I understand that the change that we want, that we desire, is going to come from within. And that means you have to be on the police department to do that. So I encourage people who have an interest and an inclination to join the police department. Now, I talk about, no one is immune, and the kinds of things that get officers into trouble. And while bias is a problem, and we know this to be true, there's many examples of it. For me, I can take race out of the equation, because what I think is problematic is that it's a person who's drunk with power, a police officer who is overzealous in the execution of their duties. And it's not so much, although we hear more about it happening in black, brown, and poor white communities, but it's not so much that, it's just an officer who's been allowed to get away with bad behavior. And so unless and until a police department admits that there's a problem, unless and until there's accountability, and that's what I hear from families, is that's what they want, is accountability. When there's a violation of policy or a protocol that ends up in a use of force where someone is hurt, or deadly force where someone is killed, unless and until there's accountability, then this is not going to change. And so when I say that, no one is immune, I just want to share a couple of examples of some other folks beside the ones that make national news that we talk about. We've heard about Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Sandra Bland, Sam DuBose, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, shot and killed by a police officer. There's a young man by the name of Dylan Noble, Zachary Hammond. I met Zachary Hammond's mom. We appeared on Dr. Phil together. A 19-year-old kid was out on a first date with his girlfriend, and somehow an undercover police officer made a wrong phone call and called Zachary's girlfriend's number and got her on the phone, and had something to do with narcotics. And the officer showed up, and the long and the short of it is, I guess the young girl did have some marijuana on her, and the officer wanted to have a conversation with Zachary, who was driving the car. Zachary panicked, like a 19-year-old kid might do, and didn't comply with the officer's request to stand down, drove off. Officer shot and killed him. Cameron Rudis, involved in we call it a 415, belligerent disturbance on campus at a university, young white kid. And officers responded. Cameron had been drinking and didn't comply, because when you don't comply as a young person, there's a price to pay. And so Cameron was ultimately shot and killed by a police officer after a short scuffle. Samantha Ramsey, young woman attending a party with some friends. Police responded. Samantha drove off. Officers were trying to stop the partygoers from leaving, and they wound up firing a round into a car that she was driving, shot and killed her. And then Bryce Masters, who wasn't killed but was tasered by a police officer, and as a result of that had brain damage. In Anaheim, California, where I live, Kelly Thomas, a young white man with mental illness issues, had engaged with police officers and ultimately was beaten severely and later died. And so no one is immune. No one is immune. And we all have a part to play in how we interact with one another. I have a video that I want you to play for me, and then we'll talk a little bit more on the other side of that video.
Now, race and justice in America. Tonight we look at efforts in Oakland, California to address bias where it exists in law enforcement. Special correspondent Jackie Judd has the story.
The racial turmoil in the U.S., stemming from encounters between police and black men, strikes a chord with Jennifer Eberhardt. The social psychologist at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, has spent her career exploring racial bias and how that plays out in the criminal justice system. Still, it came as a shock to her how embedded biases can be, biases we're not even aware of.
I'm on the airplane with my son, and he looks up and he sees a black man, and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, he doesn't look anything like my husband, and I notice he's the only black guy on the plane. And he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "But why would you say that?" And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know why I said that." And so we're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next.
Eberhardt has moved from the research lab to the streets of Oakland, 35 miles north of Palo Alto and a world away, to help a troubled police department change its ways. Like Ferguson, Cleveland, and Staten Island, the Oakland Police Department has an uneasy relationship with the minority community it serves.
There's times when I'm walking down the street and I'm accosted.
He didn't even ask me for my name. First thing he said, "Are you on probation or parole?"
Only 28% of the population here is black, but the majority of police stops, searches, and arrests involves black residents. In 2009, an unarmed black man, Oscar Grant, was shot dead at the Fruitvale BART station. Even though a transit officer killed Grant, long simmering resentment towards city officers erupted.
This area is known as the Fruitvale area of Oakland.
Rashida Grenage became a community organizer after a confrontation in her home 21 years ago, which led to the deaths of her husband, who was black, their son, and a police officer.
Good morning, this is Rashida.
Today, while Grenage says there are some fine officers and progressive commanders in the department, she believes two systems of justice prevail, one for wealthy whites in the hills around Oakland and another for minority residents in the flatlands.
There is an intuition that officers have about what they can do under which circumstances. Depending on what neighborhood they're in, depending on what they believe to be the socioeconomic profile and the resources of that person or that person's family.
And the police department would probably say because that's where most crime takes place.
But we're basing assumptions on the group someone belongs to, and that is racial or ethnic profiling.
Back in 2003, the Oakland Police Department agreed to implement court-ordered reforms that grew out of the case in which several officers were accused of framing criminal suspects. To this day, leaders are still struggling to improve relations between the police and the public.
Assistant Chief Paul Figueroa, tasked with finding ways to eliminate racial bias as the court ordered, is teamed with Jennifer Eberhardt to help change the entrenched culture.
Those are the questions that I get asked quite a bit in various meetings. Well, what's it like in East Oakland compared to West Oakland?
One of the big things that I focused on is this, what I call the Race Crime Association or the Black Crime Association. So it's not surprising really that people might associate blackness with crime, but it can come up in surprising ways, or it can influence us in ways that we don't always recognize or know about.
And that so-called implicit bias is what Eberhardt is sharing with department supervisors. Among the many studies of bias that she's conducted, one in particular brought a startling discovery. Study participants were shown pictures of black and white men, all in very rapid-fire succession. Then they were shown fuzzy images of weapons, which slowly became clear.
The black faces facilitated the detection of the crime objects, whereas the white faces inhibited the detection of those very same crime objects. So for those objects, just being exposed really quickly to these black male faces led them to need less information or fewer frames before they could pick out what those objects were.
The gun.
Yeah, right, exactly. So they needed fewer frames before they said, oh, that's a gun or that's a knife.
The stereotype of blacks as hostile, dangerous, and criminal is one of the strongest stereotypes in American society.
It's not always easy for department supervisors to hear what Eberhardt has to say, but they listen and then try to sensitize officers.
You're not alone in this, right? You're not the only one sitting in the classroom thinking, wow, is that me? You know, you could see the looks on everyone's face that they're going, oh, okay.
What kind of pushback do you get from officers when you're asking them to do things having to do with racial sensitivity?
Oftentimes, some of the pushback is, well, are we being called a racist? Is this, you know, what's all the accusations coming at us when we're working as hard as we can to bring about safety to the community? And that's part of the conversation.
On the agenda is to look at the multiple stop data.
Eberhardt and a team of student researchers also are in the midst of analyzing stop data and, importantly, body cam videos from Oakland police to determine what happens in that crucial and sometimes fraught moment between officer and citizen.
So you can look at things like pitch. You can look at the rate at which people are speaking, and you can look at loudness, and those things can tell you a lot about, you know, whether things are heated, whether things are going to escalate.
Sure.
You know.
It is the power of videos that brought tragedies like those in Cleveland and Staten Island to public attention. Eberhardt hopes the videos she is examining become tools that lead to better policing.
I feel like we're in a moment now where things can really shift. We're in a position to actually know, to really understand and to know what happens in these interactions and, you know, why it is that sometimes they go awry.
I really think Jennifer's research is going to help us identify what issues are there and design some strategies to help us intervene in some circumstances and in others question our programs and policies that are leading to some of these outcomes.
Assistant Chief Figueroa acknowledges it will take years to transform the department. Promises have been made before. Lieutenant LaRon Armstrong, who leads his own racial sensitivity sessions, knows the department has a lot of convincing to do.
We're as close as we've ever been to finally coming in to compliance with all the requirements of the negotiated settlement agreement.
Does the community feel it?
I don't know if the community feels it, because when you look at the climate in the community currently, it doesn't seem that way.
I think people are feeling vulnerable in different ways on both sides. I mean, you have community members who feel vulnerable around the police, and then there's vulnerability on the police side where when something happens in Ferguson or anywhere in the country, police departments all over the nation feel it.
You're supposed to be feeling safe because the police are there, but it's like whenever I do see them, it's like I don't feel as safe. It's kind of like irony.
This is Jackie Judd in Oakland, California for the NewsHour.
So, you know, we know that these things go on, and I don't want to certainly beat anyone over the head about, you know, what happens day in and day out. I'm really more about solutions and how do we fix this. And so, you know, I'm going to say this because I know that there are some, looks like supervisory type command staff in the back from your police agency here on campus. And you guys probably know this, I'm preaching to the choir, but you know, sometimes when officers are in a bad way, we may be going through things and it will manifest itself in the field in a way that others may not necessarily pick up on, and because self-reporting is not sexy and police officers don't do that. I know that in private industry, they have employment assistant programs that are available for their employees, but we don't always make sure that our police officers are in a good headspace. And so I would encourage you, to whatever extent you can, to just check in with your officers from time to time. I say, that if police departments would just sit down with an officer every couple of years and crack the top of their head open and make sure everything is working right, things might be better. And in those rare instances when there's someone who's not doing the job appropriately because they don't have the skill set to do that, I don't think there's any harm or shame in admitting that and helping them to a different profession. Because at the end of the day, everybody on both sides of police encounters want to go home safely. The officers want to go home safely, and the people that they are dealing with want to go home safely. And so I know that officers are reluctant to ask for help. I remember, I'll share a little story with you. As a sergeant, I responded to a radio call of a jumper. And we had been talking with this guy for some time, trying to get him to come down off this roof. And I thought he was going to come down. And after about 20, 30 minutes, he looked left and he looked right and thought he was looking for the stairs to come down off the building. And he backed up, and then he just ran with all of his might and jumped. He didn't die. And for all of us who had been engaged with this young man for so long, I assumed that it was probably something that was very difficult to deal with. I know it bothered me. I was a mother with a son about his age, and I thought, wow, I need to talk to somebody. And so I went back and told my lieutenant, the watch commander, that we needed to have somebody from our behavioral service science come over, some psychologists, and be available for officers. And they did. And by the time my officers got back from being out at the scene, and I made them aware that we had psychologists on hand, everybody was like, I'm good, Sarge, I don't need to talk about it. And so I did, because it bothered me. And I didn't see any shame and harm, and I think that's the difference between, us girls and you guys, right? That's why I think, girls do better at police work. But I felt it was important to have a conversation, because it bothered me to see this young man go off this building, land, and live. Now, I don't know how long after that he lived. I would imagine for the period of time he did, he probably wished he hadn't, because I'm telling you now, and I can remember it as though it were yesterday, the sound of bones crushing when he landed. So police officers don't want to report. They don't self-report. And there's, sometimes it's because there's concern about, having a weapon taken from you, and if you lose your gun, you can't be the police. But it's so important that we make sure our officers are in a good headspace. And so I hope that you guys will do that here on this department. And as, community members, if you guys are out there and you're dealing with someone, or you hear someone who's had an encounter, like the mayor was saying, sometimes hurt people. And if you know something, right, if you see something, say something. I think it would be helpful as a community member, someone who is invested in your police agency, to report to a division command staff officer that you had an encounter with someone, and maybe they were going through something and you're not aware of it because you're not out in the field with them, Captain so-and-so. You don't see your officers out in the field. I think that would be helpful to bring that to the attention of someone who can get this officer the kind of help that we need. Suicide rate among officers is incredibly high. It's something that you don't hear about because, again, it's not sexy to report it. But just on day before yesterday, I read an article. Chicago police officer was found dead in her car, 47 years old, self-inflicted gunshot wound. I know of at least 3 or 4 in the month of September who committed suicide, right? And so, police officers are no different than anyone else. We see things, we react to things on a daily basis that could really put you in a bad place. And so then you go out into the field and you interact with people, and sometimes you don't always interact appropriately. So understand that when you're dealing with people. Again, I'm talking about police work. It could be a coworker here who's going through a situation. It could be a family member. So although I'm talking about my own observations and beliefs based on law enforcement, this is not unique to law enforcement. So while we share this stuff with you, what we'd like you to take away, from this is to believe us. There's a basis for what we're sharing with you and what we know and what we say, and I do it because it's easy to get pushback if you're a civilian speaking about police officers who sometimes use deadly force as a first resort rather than a last resort as we're trained, or when people want to know why did an officer do a thing, it's easy to push back on someone who you may say, well, you've never been in the uniform and you don't know what it is and it's dangerous and it's tough, and I can say, well, I do because I did it. And so there's some credibility associated with how it is that I present to you, what it is that I present. So believe us, believe us. These things are real. There are surveys and statistics that speak to it, and part of that process will be shared with you by Dr. Allen, who's done a series of surveys and research in that area. But before we do that, because I see a lot of people kind of run into, I don't know where they're going, but they're leaving the room. So I'm going to say, why don't we take about a 15-minute break and stretch and grab a snack in the back, and we'll see you here in a minute.
Okay, well, we are certainly wrapping things up. Have you enjoyed yourself so far? So far, so good? Good. Well, I want to thank you in advance for how attentive each of you have been. We appreciate the open-mindedness because this is a difficult discussion to have. And I think there could be no better place to have it than here. Thank you all so much. I'd like to bring Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey up, and she's going to introduce our next presenter. But before we do that, Roland.
Oh my God! Put your hands behind your back. Oh my God! Put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest. Put your hands behind your back. God, why are you doing this to me? Put your hands behind your back.
Take a seat back in the car, please. Take a seat back in your vehicle, please. Okay, man, we're being pulled over right now, so I need you to take a seat back in the car. To see your driver's license, you're being stopped for speeding. You were about to go inside without a wallet, so I know you're only coming here because you know I was coming to pull you over. Put your feet back in the car so I can close the door, please. Okay, ma'am, stand up for me, okay?
Okay.
No.
No, why are you touching me?
Stop resisting me.
Oh my God!
Stop resisting.
Oh my God!
Put your hands behind your back right now.
Will you let me get down, please?
Get down.
I'm pissing off the stuff. Are you shitting me? Oh my God!
Okay, Miss King. Just have a seat right there.
Can I
let him check him and see if they're...
Yeah. Okay. Give me just a second.
Well, why do I have to suffer if I'm doing this before? But do you still believe that there's racism out there?
Yes. I do.
I believe the Caucasians have more working skills than other people. Yeah. They have more rights.
I don't think that.
A little afraid of black people.
Why are so many people afraid of black people?
That's what I want to figure out.
I can give you a really good idea why it might be that way. Violent tendencies. And I want you to think about that. I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying that I can prove it or nothing. But 99% of the time, when you hear about stuff like that, it is the black community that's being violent. That's why a lot of the white people are afraid, and I don't blame them.
I just want to start off by saying that my heart was sickened and saddened when I first learned of this incident on July 19th, 2016. So let me just say this to Breonna King, her family, her friends, her neighbors, her supporters. I'm sorry that on the day that you were stopped for going 15 miles per hour, you were approached in a manner and treated in a manner that is not consistent with the expectations of this police chief, of most of the officers of this police department, and most importantly, I think of all of us as human beings in terms of how the way we should be talking to each other, treating one another. I have ordered an administrative investigation into the actual stop and arrest of Ms. King to include what's happened with that officer.
So, hopefully we'll have an opportunity after having some conversation with some folks during the break to come back and talk to your young people, because, those are the ones who really need to understand the importance of comply and complain. I talk to millennials. They drive me crazy. I drive them crazy because, I say comply and they know their rights. And, I'm like, yeah, I know you have them, but do you want to make your family the next millionaire in your town because you didn't comply and you wind up the victim of deadly police force? So it's important for young people to understand that they have a role to play and that they have an affirmative responsibility to comply with a police officer. And if you're not satisfied with that, as do all of you, there's a process. Create a paper trail, file a complaint. If I kill you, there's only one version, and that's the one that I give. Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Ezell Ford, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Sam DuBose. We see this happen time and time again, even in front of a jury. Typically, what an officer says is taken as truth. I wanted to push back the narrative that was being put forth by police chiefs about why officers are using deadly force, because in my mind, they were using deadly force as a first resort and not as a last resort. I did have an impression of the LAPD growing up, and it wasn't a good one. I had many family members and friends who had negative encounters, and so I grew up kind of not liking the police. I grew up during the 60s when tank trucks came down our street because of the Watts riots. And I remember driving down a certain street with my family, and I don't know what it was because I was a little girl, but there was a big sign that said, turn left or get shot. And so that kind of stayed in my mind as a little person, and so I really had a negative view of police growing up.
What was it like being a Black female police officer?
So it was very difficult. We were the first academy class that was evenly split. It was 20 girls and 20 guys. And that was the first time that they ever had that many women in a police academy class. And I was only one of 2 Black females. I noticed that when we were given tests, my white female counterparts seemed to be given an easier task. But it was those kinds of tests, those kinds of games that were constantly being played with me. And so it didn't stop when I got out of the police academy. It continued when I got to my division of assignment. First, unless the police department, a police chief is willing to admit there's a problem, then there's nothing to fix. It's not one thing, because the problem has been there so long on both sides, the animosity in the Black, brown, and poor white communities. Police culture is what it is, and you're not going to change that anytime soon. But I think it's important for families to make sure that you have a conversation with your young people, and you make sure that your young people know how to comport themselves when the police stop them. Well, of course I worry. I mean, because when my sons leave the house, they have the same skin that I do, and I know that no one is immune. And I know that my sons could be stopped. And so what I tell my sons is the same thing that I say when I speak to young people. The police stop you, comply. And if you're not happy with the level of service, then we'll complain. That it's important to create a paper trail if officers stop you and you don't like the kind of service that you're receiving. But it's also important for you to not hold court curbside. There is no shame in surviving a police encounter